Okay, we might have to start. Welcome back, everyone. I hope that you enjoyed your morning tea. My name is Sareh Moosavi. I'm a lecturer in environmental planning and design at the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning at the University of Melbourne. I've recently rejoined the faculty after 3 years of a postdoctoral research fellowship in Belgium. So some of the examples that you might see here are coming from my research being based at the Urban Metabolism Lab at the University Catholic of Leuven in Belgium, in Brussels. I also wanted to thank Deborah for her fantastic opening lecture. A lot of the points that you made talk directly to our panel on metabolism and the cities of flows. So I thought I would first maybe use 5 minutes in the beginning before we bring the panelists up to the stage to set the scene in terms of why metabolism. What does it have to do with our cities or with climate change? We might all be familiar with the headlines such as, these 5 superfoods can boost your metabolism and help you lose weight, or 3 daily habits for a healthy metabolism. Well, just like the human body has a metabolism, the city also has a metabolism. Cities requires resources to function. They consume and metabolize resources and dispose of what is left over in forms of waste and pollution. A healthy city needs a healthy resource diet. Let's have a look at the metabolism of a forest ecosystem and healthy forest ecosystem. As beautifully captured by the Belgian ecologist and botanist Paul Duvigneau in the 1970s, as we can see in nature, all energy use is renewable and non-polluting. All resources are obtained in the vicinity using non-extractive techniques. Nature creates no waste. Waste is a genuine human invention. It is a connected system of cooperative and symbiotic relationships. The discard of one process is the input of another one. Nature has the genius of thriving and self-regulating. It is 100% circular. In a striking contrast, Duvigneau also illustrated one of the first applications of a metabolic lens to read the resource flow of the city of Brussels, also in the 1970s. The current linear throwaway society is the opposite of the forest ecosystem. Resources are extracted, transported, sometimes from miles away, manufactured, sold, used, and often discarded in a linear pattern. While the accounting method used by Duvigneau and later by a lot of industrial ecologists appears to be highly mechanistic and sometimes reductionist, reducing flows to numbers, it is still a powerful reminder of how our activities have cut those natural processes out of balance by replacing them with monofunctional, centralized infrastructure, as Deborah also beautifully captured in her keynote lecture. The concept of metabolism provides us with a powerful metaphor that helps us understand the phenomenal complexity tied to our cities and its resources. But it goes beyond a metaphor. It offers a diagnostic tool to understand where our actions are most resource-intensive, degenerative, and harmful to ecosystems underlying our cities. It also allows us to scan our building stocks as resource assets, and to read our landscapes through the invisible environmental flows that are highly interconnected, from the territorial scale all the way down to the scale of our urban furniture. Metabolism allows us to think differently about the relationships between the urban and the hinterlands, and their interdependencies, bringing to the spotlight sites of extraction. For any shiny intervention here, there are multiple dark spots elsewhere, or what is known as shadow places, where specific communities are displaced or distressed. It's time to look differently at resources and to redefine waste as a resource, but also as a source to spark creativity. What does this mean for the built environment professionals, for designers, for spatial thinkers? Is material-driven design the future of design practice? Where the design workflows kind of are inverse. We start from what is available, then think about design, rather than designing, then materializing. As it used to be for the first tens of thousands of years of the existence of Homo sapiens on this planet. Some emerging practices are leading the way. Experimenting with circularity at the scale of neighborhood and precinct scale, such as the Beveridge in Amsterdam, where it used to be a former shipyard, using some of the infrastructure, some of the ships as housing, temporary housing, and other uses. Where natural processes are incorporated into the design in moving to a circular metabolism rather than a linear one. But challenges exist when upscaling. How can integrating a metabolic thinking across the life stages of the built environment, coming back to the built environment process map, where we define those different life stages that different sectors and actors of the built environment engage with, how can we couple metabolic thinking into life cycle thinking? Which sectors and actors have more agency when it comes to decisions regarding resources? And which sector and actors can drive the transformation that we need in our practice and shifting paradigms? These are some of the questions that we are going to be tackling in this panel, and we have a fantastic panel that are going to join us soon up the stage. But first, I would like to introduce our Assistant Dean of Sustainability, Dr. James Helal, and our esteemed panel to join me on the stage for hopefully a very fruitful conversation. Thanks.
Can everyone hear me? Yeah, okay. Thank you, Sareh, for the excellent introduction to metabolism. I'd like to just start before presenting the panelists to remind you all that this is an interactive session where we'd like to ask you to please engage with the panelists in posing questions on the Q&A Slido. So you'll be able to post questions. You can even reply and comment on each other's questions, upvote them, and also in the spirit of metabolism, in which systems can accept or reject substances. You can even downvote questions as well. So even if you don't intend to ask a question, scan that anyway, because if you do think of a question midway, then at least you've got the page open on your phone. Okay, I'll begin by introducing the panelists, just their names and titles for now, before asking the first question. So beginning with Professor Sareh Bell, who is the City of Melbourne Chair in Urban Resilience and Innovation at the Melbourne City for Cities here at the University of Melbourne. We also have Heidi Lee, who is the CEO of Beyond Zero Emissions. We have also Jodie Bricout, who's the Design Director of Circular Economy at Aurecon. And we have Martin O'Day, who's the Principal Landscape Architect at CLOUSTON Associates, which is a division of Beveridge Williams. And in case you didn't hear Sareh's introduction, because it was quite busy when Sareh started her talk, we also have Dr. Sareh Moosavi, who's a lecturer in environmental planning and design here in the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning at the University of Melbourne. And my name is James Helal. I'm the Assistant Dean of Sustainability, also in the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning. Okay, to kick off the discussion, Sareh and I thought that it might be a good idea to pose the same question to all the panelists and hear about what they think of the concept of urban metabolism. So it's a relatively new metaphor that's being used for the built environment. Not everyone is familiar with it, perhaps, and even if you are, there are different interpretations. And so I'd like to perhaps begin with Sarah, and then we can move down the line. So can you share your perspective on what the metabolism of cities mean, and how this concept influences you and how you think about cities and how we go about improving them? Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, James. I think I've been, I guess, metabolism adjacent for much of my career. And so I've seen metabolism and it align concepts like industrial ecology, thinking of cities as biological systems come and go in different ways. And that starts right from when I was a graduate engineer on an aluminium smelter in Queensland and was assigned the task to manage all sorts of noxious but highly calorific wastes, and went out from the smelter to other industrial actors in the kind of region, trying to find ways to not look at it as a waste but as a resource, and found that was really hard to do, and wasn't successful at it. And there are lots of really kind of technical, we had a very supportive regulatory environment, but there are lots of very basic kind of materials handling and process engineering reasons why it was very hard to turn our byproduct into someone else's energy source. I then went and did a PhD in sustainability and technology policy in a unit that was quite well known for sustainable cities work, and they were talking about the work of Herbert Girardet and others talking about the metabolism of cities and cities as organisms. But at the time I was working on sustainable agriculture and didn't really pay much attention, and then I ended up teaching sustainability to civil engineers in London and taught them the history of London sewers, and came across ideas from the 19th century of the city as a venous arterial system. This was a great new kind of scientific concept back then, and campaigners and engineers trying to come up with sanitary systems that thought about water and waste flowing through cities as a biological metaphor. Then came across human geographers who were very critical of the idea of just thinking about cities as biological metaphors, because it denied human agency, because it undermined very important power kind of structures, who wins, who loses from different material flows and energy flows in cities. So I can continue on, but suffice to say that I'm somewhat, I guess, slightly sceptical of the latest new metaphor or rediscovered metaphor that we come across in our language of sustainability, and thinking through new ways of creating better societies and cities, and yet always open to, what might be useful out of a metaphor. But I think, we might be able to come back to some of the limits of of this particular metaphor, and yet really thinking about what are the underlying issues that we're trying to address, and how might we start to actually demonstrate that change and, chip away at changes that we need to know that need to happen in our cities, in our structures, in our professions, to actually start to make it happen, rather than trying to endlessly look for the perfect metaphor.
Thank you, Sarah. That deserves an applause, yeah. Heidi, your take on metabolism?
Thank you so much. I'll keep talking. My mic will work. Look at that little example of like a ecosystem at work. Yeah, we calibrated there. I'm Heidi. I am a recovering architect. I am now running a think tank in a post-truth world. So the opportunity, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me. So when I started out as an architect in the industry, definitely not an architect, but in the industry in the late 90s, a whole lot of what we were doing then was trying to put numbers back on understanding whether we were doing good work or bad work in terms of the environment. And coming up through that phase of quantifying everything, it was incredibly helpful for some things, right? Like it was really useful for us to understand that things that were energy intensive or things that had a lot of pollution, you could put a number on it, and then you could start to make comparisons and help, hopefully, in a way that helped us make less bad decisions. But in the 20 years that I spent in the industry as a draftee and different roles in different firms and then as an architect, we got to go through that entire journey of trying to make things less bad, trying to make things maybe a little bit good or, balance each other out, and then potentially even try to use each intervention in the built environment as an opportunity to leave the world a better place. But each time we do that as practitioners, we're really limited by what materials are on the market, what we're allowed to do. And I hated policy. I hated all of that side of the work until I realised that I was never going to have great materials to specify. I was never going to get great equipment to specify unless I actually put myself to that side of things. So the opportunity that I have running a think tank is the chance to intervene in policy in a way that helps Australia's businesses, our manufacturers, our makers, give you a broader palette and a cleaner palette, a healthier palette to be able to work with. Some of the things that we do at Beyond Zero Emissions are primarily related to heavy industry for the last few years. So our main policy angle there was looking at how groups of manufacturers operating as an ecosystem, as a precinct, have opportunities for decarbonisation, for using renewable energy. They have opportunities for consolidating their energy needs as well. So actually you need to build less infrastructure. There's less land required, less energy firming services required. If you are able to consolidate the user side of things, not just the generation side of things, it works on both sides of the chicken and the egg in that equation. But it also gives you a chance to look at industrial ecology, which is the typical metaphor that's used on that side of things. And we get to look at places, there's some great ones, great one here in Australia in the Kwinana industrial area, I'm sure you're familiar with, which has a governance structure over an entire precinct of manufacturers that enables them to be able to use waste products out of one factory as inputs to other industrial processes. So this is a chance for us to take concepts like ecology or concepts like metabolism and look at systems and flows and use things in a more cohesive and complete way. But we need to be aware that to have those opportunities, a whole lot of regulation has to change to give us the chance to take action that is possible. We already have those materials and those equipments, but for it to be possible for those to be implemented at scale in a way that makes a difference, we actively need to work on policy.
Is anyone else excited about all the shared language? I feel like I've just found my people on stage in such a big way. So I've been a closet engineer for many years, but then I started working for a big engineering firm 2.5 years ago. So I've had to really be at home with my engineering past. I'm from Adelaide and I moved to France quite early in my career and found myself as a project manager in a industrial ecology precinct in Dunkirk. And that was my first confrontation with concepts around industrial ecology, very closely linked to urban metabolism, this notion about stocks and flows in a place, in a patch. And similar to you, Sarah, that very real experience of knocking on doors and organising. We used to organise shared barbecues between the different businesses so that they could talk about materials. Funnily enough, it works the same in France as in Australia. If you share a snag, you're more likely to do business deals. So you got to see that really coalface aspect of what it takes in a very human way to make some of these sharing and collaborations happen in an industry area. Coming back, then really discovered life cycle assessment, which I find a really interesting parallel to urban metabolism rather than a place-based approach, a supply chain approach. And I think when we're talking about the interface and the limits between different metaphors, I like the horses for courses, right? In certain times, explaining how things flow territorially or, in a precinct or place is really important for people to get their heads around how different resources should be used. But then likewise, understanding how it works up and down supply chains with that kind of material and water and energy backpack that you get when you buy that chair and when you grab this glass of water. They really enable you to think differently about the choices you're making, how you're producing and how you're optimising systems. I love it, Heidi, that you talked about being less bad, though, because when I first discovered LCA and I ran a platform for LCA in northern France, it's all about being less bad. You're just trying to optimise. Let's do less damage here and do less damage here. And it was at the times I was having babies as well. So trying to optimise any damage that you're having, and then you bring another human into the world. You're like, oh my God, what am I doing? And then I discovered another metaphor around circular economy, which is really focused on doing. So how do we achieve the things we want to do? So we design out waste, we keep things at their highest value, and we regenerate nature. And maybe if we get those things right, we can go from the analysing and trying to do less bad and manage a bit better to actually having a shot at having a good way of living on this planet of ours with an ecosystem that supports us and nurtures us as well. So I really like the discussion about the metaphors and where they come into play. And I think it's interesting that people need and decision makers need the numbers and they need the evidence base. We all need stories as well to get our heads around different concepts to understand how to act. We need the policy as well. But yeah, we need to get going and act. And today in my work, working for a big engineering firm, so at Aurecon we design and deliver all sorts of big and small infrastructure, and I run a circular economy team within that. So we also work on smaller projects as well, like we did a circular roadmap for Monash University and things like that. And where urban metabolism comes into that is the mapping of flows and the material flow assessment type work. And it's really amazing the kind of diagrams that Sareh showed. You see things differently when you see how things flow either on your site or on your university or within your neighbourhood, and you're able to really understand that you are all connected. So that systems thinking becomes very real when you're working through problems in that way.
Hello, hey, that's better. Hi, I'm Martin. I'm a landscape architect. I'm principal landscape architect at CLOUSTON Associates in Sydney on Cadigal Country. And we're a part of Beveridge Williams, which has been here in Melbourne for over 60 years. I'm sort of not necessarily going to talk necessarily about metabolism, but more about some of the flows. And as a landscape architect, I'm quite interested in the intersection of climate and water, and been quite heavily involved in work with the Australian Institute of Landscape Architects and the International Federation of Landscape Architects around climate positive design and how that impacts how we think about design. And I guess some of the flows and metabolism in a city are quite often non-living things like aluminium and steel and transport and vehicles and so forth. But as a landscape architect, we're really involved in partly the biological side, so the living systems within the city, so trees and plants and so forth. And I guess one of the key things in terms of flows in a city is that interaction primarily of water and how that impacts, say, green infrastructure. And that whole idea of green in the city we see as a very important thing in terms of climate mitigation and climate adaptation. So with water, for example, it's quite often seen as a waste rather than a resource, and we still design cities like we probably did in the 1950s, where water that falls on the city is designed to flow out of the system as fast as possible through concrete pipes, and that creates a whole raft of problems on its own. But I guess as a landscape architect, what we're very keen on doing is how do we slow down that flow of water in the city? How do we use it to infiltrate the soil, hydrate the soil, and help it to produce a cool green environment where we've got big shady leafy trees. And so one of the key things is passive irrigation, and the idea of gravity running things is very important, and no energy required. And I guess it's trying to change, how do we change from what is a very linear system with water, where water falls in a very distant catchment, it gets stored in a dam, it then gets treated to drinking water quality. We drink a tiny amount of that and we flush pretty much all of it down the sewer system back into the ocean. So how do we, a metabolic flow approach to that would be looking at how do we recapture that water that lands in the city? How do we recycle the sewage that we have, and how do we actually sort of use those to our advantage, particularly on a dry continent like Australia, where we really, really need to be managing our water?
Hello. Already hearing very different perspectives that all connected through a thread, but I was very interested, Jodie, in your take on a common language, and you're like feeling comfortable of hearing the language that you like. And yesterday we had a meeting, industry meeting with Sareh, and it was discussed that we need to get our narratives right. We need to get a common narrative as built environment professionals and get the words out there. Do you think, the familiarity with the concept that is not really used in practice, do you think the more that we talk about it in forums like this, would it actually be taken up by practitioners?
That's such a tricky question. And I kind of, more and more as I go through it, so I would love us all to have a very set, clear way that we speak about everything, and that, circular economy would be on top of everything for me, but then other people would have sustainability on top. Everyone's got their bubble, right, and their thought of how it interacts. Living and working in a new and different language really taught me to question how things are expressed and got across, right? Because I think everyone, they measure and understand things based on their language and their context and what they've been through and what they've seen. So I find when I'm doing training, for example, I throw out a few different ways of communicating a concept. So I might, show a nice metabolism flow, nice sort of material flow chart. Some people need to touch things and hear a story. Some people need to see numbers. Some people work in frameworks. I love the framework. That's kind of where I live. Some people really don't care about the framework. They just want to know what to do on their project right now, this second. So I'm actually really into, yes, we need to kind of get each other and understand and use terms well, but I think we need to work with what works for people and respect that one organisation might frame things a little bit differently to another, and you're going to get much better results if you frame it according to their language. And there's lots of shades of grey, so as long as it's not radically incorrect, I think you can shape it to what that organisation understands and really focus on the doing and learning and having that innovative approach of, even though this has all been done before, and we've been drawing diagrams since the 75s, and we should have gotten going much further by now and have more impact, like still having that notion every time that we're innovating and we're falling down and we're getting up again, and we're making it better and better every time, and so we've all got a role to play in it.
I might just chip in there, because I do think that we have to be careful of thinking that, the reason why we haven't seen change at the speed that we know is needed is because we haven't clearly communicated the message. Like, the message is pretty clear. Or we need more data, or we need a new diagram. We've got lots of those, and we have seen them keeping on change. And I think of the same mind as you, of great. If a donut is your thing, and that's what communicates to people, use the donut. If it's a metabolism, great, use that. If it's a Venn diagram, because you're from 1987, do that too. But I think, particularly as academics, spending our time trying to come up with a perfect concept that, this will be the idea that will change everything, I think we need to actually just start realising that it's not a communication problem. There's no perfect framework. Yes, come up with ways to communicate complex ideas as well as we can. But actually the reason why things are changing is aren't changing is because There are really particular structures of power and technologies that are locked in that are hard to change. So we need to actually face the reality that what we're doing is hard. Communicating is part of the issue, but this is not a communications problem fundamentally.
Thanks, Sarah. I've got an alarm on my phone that's about to go off with 15 minutes to go to ensure that we get enough audience participation. There it is. If you haven't put any questions in, please take a minute to do so. And while you do that, maybe we can unpack some of that substance and the barriers that you're talking about. Metaphors come and go. Perhaps the substance is what is most important. So maybe a question to Heidi, perhaps. So what are those challenges, whether they be economic or technological or cultural, that are inhibiting our way of thinking more circularly or metabolically, or whatever the metaphor is?
I think this is probably really central to a whole lot of my personal journey, is understanding how I can use what I now realise about the world and the way it operates to actually change it, because it needs to change. And individually, you know, we're all pretty ineffectual. Doesn't matter if you've got the perfect metaphor or whatever, the perfect LCA model. Individually, that's pretty limited when it comes to the scale of the challenge ahead. Because there's so much rhetoric, and it is inevitably a political conversation, and it's political engagement. I think that when we see ourselves only by the limits or only by the thing that we can do alone, we are foregoing the opportunity of collaborating with others to overcome where we can actually be, you know, greater than the sum of our parts. I've got to show some metaphors in there, you know. So greater than the sum of your parts, right? Because we might know quite a lot beyond zero emissions. We've got a huge portfolio of research, sector-based decarbonisation plans for every sector of the economy. We've had that since 2010. We can show that you can build enough concentrating solar thermal plants with molten salt storage, plus wind farms and all the grid firming services, repower the country, have green exports that are worth 3 times the amount of our current fossil fuel exports. You can put regional communities back at the centre of every of community and industry. You can address your supply chains with place-based developments around those regional centres. We could make a third of the new technologies and equipment that needs to be deployed across our buildings, our cities, right here in Australia. And in doing that, you'd keep another $200 and something billion onshore just over the next 10 years. And you'd actually build entire workforces, modernise the workforce. You can do all of this. We know how to do it, right? So like mic drop, done. But the thing is, people don't care. They don't see themselves as part of it. And we're not just needing to convince the academic workforce or the professional workforce that this is something that is in your best interest. You actually need to convince a whole lot of people who are making day-by-day decisions about running small businesses and running factories and whether or not they're going to have a job at the end of the year. This is us being able to engage politically and conceptually with economic decisions, with big decisions about national security, with way bigger things than what most architects, I'll say for free, are really trained to talk about or deal with in your training and in your early days of your profession. So as we move on, I'm going to share, like, when it comes to communication, the biggest thing that I had to be retrained in when I moved out of architecting and into running a think tank that aimed to engage genuinely and proactively across political lines was to speak in small words, do not use metaphors, do not assume that you have a common language around your values, but do appreciate that you have common values with so many other people that you're trying to engage with. People who like nuclear, people who like coal, generally also care about nature, and they care about trees, and they care about their kids, they care about family, they care about community. We have common values that underpin a whole lot of what we do. Communication, our fixation on getting the perfect words and getting it, explaining this simplicity and marvelling at the complexity of it all, holds us back from getting shit done.
Thanks, Heidi. I think you also answered the first question that's been posed by the audience, which is, can the panel talk a bit about non-material flows such as disinformation, and how should we address that? So if anyone else would like to address that, but I think you've done a Good job so far. Maybe we'll move on to the second question, which is, what are, in your view, the top 3 priorities that need to be tackled for climate action in cities? Would anyone like to? Martin?
Hi, look, I would put probably policy as the first one. So we need the right policies to guide things. Secondly, we need leadership in companies from CEOs down to the junior staff. And then thirdly, sort of the skills and understanding how to do it.
Yeah, it's such a hard question. I always balk at the silver bullet questions. Something that I'm really concerned about right now is that as humans, I think we're getting very selfish and self-centered and isolated from each other. And I think that's manifesting in different ways in how our economy flows. So it was really interesting being reframed on the common good from infrastructure. I think we've forgotten about that and we just want new and shiny to win elections. And it's not always about this is a road that's really actually required. And I think the more that as people we are disconnected from each other, we're kind of, some of those core values are eroding away a little bit. And that really concerns me. And it's not an area where I work directly, but I think that's kind of sitting behind all the good work that we're trying to do. That's a real challenge.
Fantastic. Sarah?
I would start with community-based action and figuring out how we can scale that up. So, because I think that helps to bring people together to actually know their neighbours so that they know how to respond in times of emergency. And I also think it's a way of starting to actually demonstrate change, bringing more trees, bringing more, slowing down water flows, actually starting to see how we might physically change our streets, our homes, our neighbourhoods. So I would start with community-based action. I would focus on precinct scale so that we can start to see some of these flows. And yeah, I don't know, then more ice cream maybe. I don't know what my third one is, but I've got 2.
We have just built a new 3-year strategy. We're funded by philanthropy, so you've got to go and convince a lot of wealthy people and organisations to part with money to do our work. So what's landing at the moment? The key things holding Australia back as a country from getting on with meeting decarbonisation targets is the lack of coordination around the major projects that need to come online, recognising that each of our cities are actually interdependent on not just what we're doing within the boundaries of the city, but also those hinterland conversations, and that does include energy, but includes a lot of other flows as well, food, nature, etc. So a national action plan will unblock blockages that we're making by trying to do major projects everywhere all at once. There's not enough labour, there's not enough materials, it's driving up the price of things, it's extending project approvals, it is requiring us to refinance projects because they haven't gotten through that yet. Planning and coordination is absolutely fundamental. So get in touch with me afterwards if you want to get involved and you've got a bright idea.
Thanks. So Andre, you asked for 3, you got 12 top priorities. I'll just combine, I think, 2 questions that try to speak to the same thing, and just because we haven't heard enough of it on the panel. The question is, so many people recognize that climate change is an issue, but not many change their behavior. Where do you believe this disconnect resides? And another question, which I think is related to it, it's how do we challenge the consumption culture?
I have a piece of research that I can point you to around the dissonance between beliefs and behaviour. So the climate compass is been built for an Australian context. Dr. Rebecca Huntley did a lot of that work in partnership with, if someone can shout me out the other name of the organisation she worked with, that'd be great. The climate compass identifies the main things that you're likely to believe about climate across 7 subcategories, and then what you're actually doing and likely not doing even though you may be right over on the hard left of the screen saying, I think climate is an urgent issue, chances are you probably haven't done things like change your superannuation over to a green fund. You probably haven't changed your bank or your mortgage because cost of living, and you're probably not writing to your local politician or your elected member and leveraging your voice as a political actor either.
There is a really interesting question that is also a research question that I've been grappling with in my research. In addressing urban metabolism and climate change, what does industry want to see from academia? And what does academics want to see from industry? That's a hard one, right? Who wants to go? Sarah?
We would like to see more commitment to demonstration so that we can learn alongside projects actually happening in the real world, and also a recognition of, as a researcher, I always like industry to you can come to us with your consulting questions, and that's a very nice learner for the faculty, and we can do useful stuff, but to come to us with those longer term questions, the kinds of things that can't be answered in 6 or 12 months, might get to some kind of answers at the end of a 3 or a 4 year PhD, but might be a kind of 10-year horizon. So yeah, a commitment to work together, access to kind of data and sites and projects so that we can work alongside you, and a recognition that, and a commitment to a long-term kind of discovery together rather than an expectation that we have the answers to the political cycle for the next election or to your next client.
I'll put from the consultant point of view to the academic side of things. And one of the things that Sarah mentioned there was the practical things and demonstration projects. One of the things we really need to have on the ground is demonstration projects. People will say, well, I've never done that before. And you say, well, actually, here it is. And look, this is the results. So what we'd love to be able to have is projects where we work with academia and they spit out the data that sort of says this particular project did this because of Y, because of Z. It's much better because of this, and this is the data that supports it, and it's cheaper, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it'd be great to have some real projects on the ground with sort of info and facts that are really easily digestible, and we can help people sort of think, actually, we can do it.
I'd like to add a comment from the industry perspective on that one as well, because usually we are really frustrated because we want something quite short term, and the ask from university would be go faster and be more nimble and be able to come back to us in a reasonable time frame and that kind of thing, which is just impossible. But this commitment to ongoing collaboration and partnership is really important because we don't really know all the time the questions we should be asking, those long-term things, because we are like running all the time. So Aurecon's got a partnership with the University of Adelaide, for example. We've got partnerships with several universities, but I co-chair a research stream on that where we're actually spending a bit of time just getting to know each other as well and picking up the phone and talking through issues before it becomes a question or a project, and that's really valuable as well because actually we're kind of from different worlds and sometimes we don't really understand what you have to offer and you don't understand what we have to offer either.
Sounds like we need a research symposium. Another question. Is enough being done into incorporating urban metabolism into the planning of new precincts? And how does it go from box ticking to being central to urban growth?
Hello. Being I guess the person involved in that sort of type of thing, precinct thing, I guess metabolism is not really something that's really talked about a lot in a way in terms of, where are we doing metabolism? I think people are talking much more about how do we reduce our impact, how do we make things as sustainable as possible, how do we recycle, how do we do all those sort of things. So I think there is it does need to be done very early. If you look at, say, carbon, about 80% of the carbon's locked into a project at concept design. So it's really important, as a consultant team and team groups thinking up front, what are the outcomes we want to try and get to here? We want to be biodiversity positive, climate positive, water positive, energy positive. How do we how do we achieve all those if we are running a project? So I think it's the questions you ask at the start.
No.
I would just add, here in the faculty, I'm the director of the Retrofit Lab, and we're looking to work with industry and other university partners to really drive the agenda around retrofitting our built environment to deal with climate change, biodiversity and public health crises. Some of you may recall from a previous symposium, it was our symposium last year. So I would start with that. So actually we need to start with retrofitting our rather than focusing on new precincts, focus on retrofitting our existing built environment, and wherever possible where we are regenerating or developing a new precinct, look at retaining whatever built environment resources are already there and repurposing them, rather than looking to new build our way out of these crises.
So I'm going to put a vote in for, if you want a better built environment, you've got to be willing to be held to account for hitting hard limits that are expressed in real terms, not percentage reductions against arbitrary baselines made in a particular year, because that's when people got together. Thank you for that. The way that that actually looks in practice, though, is by saying that you can develop as much as you like of this piece of land, which should be connected into existing services, as long as you don't create any extra demand for its net zero on water, it's net zero on energy, it's net zero on carbon, because you know what, we've spent our carbon budget. There is no magical carbon budget sitting around waiting for your next project. It's done. You are only doing damage with every new project. Offsets are a farce, so if you want to be held to account, hold yourself to a higher standard and really look for pulling in that direction. When enough of us are willing to step into the arena and do that, that is where we prove that things that are not possible for us to do individually, because I certainly can't do that by myself, but I reckon if we got together as a group, we absolutely can solve the challenges that currently seem completely insurmountable like that.
We just released a report with Circular Australia on circular precincts, and I'd argue that the urban metabolism concept really sits behind that, although it might not be on every page, but very similar concepts, systems thinking, flows, etc. And the kind of support and the reaction to that report's been really heartening, that people are absolutely looking at this. They're trying to work out how to get it right. It's complex on every project, on every site. Everyone starts with quite lofty ambitions. They all get watered down, things that are available locally to be able to do in that area, not necessarily what people want. As the project goes forward as well, the money kind of magically disappears and we lower the bar. But there are also some really great examples of, Kwinana's one of them, but other projects in Australia that are doing really great aspects of them. So I think we've got a shopping list of really amazing learnings already in Australia. One of them is the Tonsley Innovation Precinct in South Australia that was built on a former Mitsubishi plant, and they kept the slab. They had an incredibly strong concrete slab for the whole plant and the jigsaw shaped roof, and they made the entire model very plug and play within that. So as it's grown over the past 10 years, businesses have moved in, they've plugged, like literally plugged into the roof to get all their water, and they haven't touched the slab or the roofing. So they've really built in that concept of urban renewal, and they really locked in, they really used a lot of the carbon very, very well on that project. But most importantly, it enables flex as well moving forward, right? Because we don't know exactly what it's going to look like in 3, 5, 10 years. So the more you're building in the system so that we can flex and grow with it, and, COVID comes, we shift a little bit, whatever the next thing is, we can shift to that. It's really exciting as well.
On the schedule, it says we've got till 11:30, but we do have a bit more time.
15 minutes late.
Okay, perfect. And on the notion of time, and I think, Jodie, you alluded to it, this is a question that just came through. It says metabolizing has a time element to it. How do we decide the lifespan of buildings and infrastructure elements so they fit into metabolic processes and systems?
So cool. Time is so important. Some things should last a long time. Some things should be designed to flip quite quickly. A great example of that is a company called X-Frame that some of you might have heard of. And I love thinking about as well, the transition piece. So what are we doing where we're using the materials that are around us and trying to figure out how to maybe use them imperfectly? We talked about that earlier. So what do we do with what we got? And it's not perfect and it's messy. And then how do we design from here on so that we're actually doing it by design in the future? And X-Frame are a company that they've got a system for interior fit outs. So at ANZ banks now, if you were to rip open, I don't advise that you do this next time you go to the bank, but if you rip open all their cloisons and stuff, I think that's a French word, but that's okay, you'll see that's made from almost like jigsaw pieces behind it. It's like a Lego componentry system. And so that can be when they're refreshing in 3 years, they take it apart, they put it back together and they order the spare parts to be able to get the new design that they want. So it's actually built to be able to move again and again. And in flooding areas, they're actually putting it in using marine grade plywood so that next time that main street has a flood event, they can actually just take everything apart, fan it down and put it back together. So it's incredibly nimble. So that's the example of something being designed so that it can be refreshed and changed frequently, but then you've got your other stuff that you want to hold forth for a long time. One other thing I wanted to say on time, because if we just thought longer term, I think we'd make much better decisions. And I saw one incredible Indigenous elder speak about how for his people and at least the groups around him, they made decisions based on 7 generations. And if you're making decisions based on 7 generations, what is the point of having a war? Because you've got to trade with your neighbours. And I really like using that when doing acknowledgements and stuff because it's so pertinent to circular economy and to urban metabolism. If only we were thinking at that level of time, I think our solutions now would be so much better anyway.
I'll add this. That's such an incredible and important story, I think, to hold in front of decision making, right? And part of what I get approached with a lot is asked, is this a good product? Is this gonna save the world? It's like this one contains all this recycled plastic. This one's a way of turning wood chip into something. This one takes carbon dioxide out of the air and does some cool products with it. When we think about time, how we invest and how we spend this idea of pollution, it's not really a carbon budget, it's just pollution. Thinking about what we have to hand today in terms of our waste, in terms of our embodied materials sitting around in landfills and other places or as part of our waste products. Sometimes we don't want to make products that depend on us having those waste streams. We actually want to be able to say, yes, for now, we're going to recapture that stray plastic or recapture that post-consumer waste. But at the same time, this entire approach has its own lifespan, and at some point we are going to stop this process, and that product or these materials are not going to be part of our future design and our future thinking. So I think that's part of those examples of thinking for now, and seasons and weather events, but also thinking about what good looks like in 7 generations' time.
Just on the emerging practices in Australia, there are so many individual practices that are pushing the boundaries. Aspire, for example, closed loop. And with the last year's federal government circular economy ministerial advisory group that was shaped, that they are going to release their first Australian national circular economy framework by December. So that's very positive and hopeful. How do you think that will be uptook by practices? Would it make any difference to have a framework in place that comes from that federal level?
Just check if this is being recorded or not. So secretly, this is the best time to be talking about what comes out, because we talked about how things get watered down as soon as they get... I think whatever comes out isn't going to be revolutionary, right? But right now it's really exciting because you can pretend that it is. And you can tell all the companies that they absolutely have to get all their ducks in a row and get going, etc. So I really enjoy that flipping about, because you're always a bit disappointed. The next framework comes out or the next metaphor comes out and it doesn't fundamentally change the world because it still needs change. Something that I heard that maybe gave me a little bit of hope the other day, yesterday actually, speaking to someone in the Melbourne office, and we were talking about the election that we don't talk about, and that actually sometimes when government's making good strides, the private sector just goes, okay, they've got this. We don't have to do so much. So sometimes you actually see, and not all the time, we absolutely need better policy, absolutely. But this is what's getting me up in the morning at the moment, is that maybe in certain jurisdictions where policy might not be what we want in the coming term, hopefully some business will stand up and take stride. And I like to think about how this messy systems change, you need all of these different actors to make moves. So some of them will take big steps and little steps at different times, but we need everyone to be moving. So we'll see what we get in that circular economy roadmap. Hopefully at a very minimum, it will say that the government cares about this, and it will give some really important frameworks to think about and work to. And we're seeing already with the new public procurement framework that they've released that, Defence, for example, are trying to figure out how on earth they're going to report on the circularity of all they're still thinking more downstream, but they're going, oh my gosh, we're going to have to understand what the materials are that we are procuring. So they're going to ask different questions, and that's going to have these draw-on effects. But I guess I'm saying don't hold our breath that that's the solution either. Like, we need to be pushing our own people and our own sphere of influence at the same time.
I got some great advice about whether or not we should get the pom-poms out for a policy announcement. And it was if the policy announcement or the framework comes out and it's got no money attached to it, you wind it back a bit. And if it's got M's attached to it, then, that's progress. But if you really care about something, you've got B's, you've got billions or more attached to this stuff. That's what actually shows that you care and that you take it seriously.
Probably just add that policy is very important still, and it does actually partly get over voluntary action. Like when we do work, particularly when we're trying to do good work, we're relying on our clients to be good guys or good girls to do the right thing. We're going to do the right thing with this thing. But if you've got a policy lever, you can say, actually, you have to do this. It's like, okay, well, we have to do it. And we just had a recent meeting on a project where the ESD framework was brought out, and there was these 10 things that the client, which was a council, wanted. And it was really good because it got everyone talking about zero emissions. It got talking about chlorofluorocarbons. It got them talking about recycling, got them talking about, and this was at an early planning stage, so they're having to think about it. So policy, even if it might not have the backing behind it, I think can still help drive things, particularly when, meeting the very basic of neighbours or the NCC, all those sort of things is where people start from. We need to be able to get it to be a higher level of achievement.
Okay, excellent. It's almost impossible to wrap up the discussion, but we heard a lot about metaphors, their limitations, but also their possible uses. But we all agreed, I think, on the importance of the substance beneath these metaphors. And we heard a lot of substance today when it comes to leadership and skills and common language and community-based action and place-based works and policy and pom-poms, which is great. I'll just maybe pass it on to Sareh, maybe to say final words and thank our panelists.
Yeah, thank you so much all for being here and for all the intervention. I think that last point was a really great segue to our next panel session on policy. So let's hear about those. On that note, I'm going to invite Dr. Anna Herdman to come up to the stage for our next panel session. Thank you so much for being here.